So this week I wrote a poem. This poem is partially inspired by a poetry class that I'm currently in. And a couple of weeks ago, we were exposed to the idea of poetic architecture, which is where you make your poem to physically resemble an image related to the topic that you're uh, writing about. And so the example given was this poem. It was called The Altar by I think George MacDonald, and the poem was in the literal shape of an altar. And I just thought that was so captivating and interesting, and I had never come across it before, and I wanted to try my own luck at doing something like that. And And in keeping with this week's theme of middle adulthood and generativity, I drew on the inspiration of the redwood tree. Um, I worked in Muir Woods last year for 6 months, and I became deeply and intimately connected with the redwoods, as it's really hard to avoid doing that. And I learned a lot about how it works, how it engages with the rest of the ecosystem, its role in the ecosystem, just the phenomenal ingenuity and majesty of this organism. And so I'm going to share my screen. And I realized last time when I shared my screen for the poem that I didn't enlarge it well enough when the recording was made for you to be able to see the poem well. So I'll make sure to zoom um, better this time. So I'll read the poem first and then comment on it. Let's get it. There we go. Okay. Poem's title is Redwood. Gulping, fresh fog, spindly needles drinking, bark's acid your shield, shielding your armor from critters. Woodpeckers, shielding acorns. They tread carefully. Bark's acid a strong repellent. Flashing frenzy of fiery fuchsia. Bulging burls, bud shoots beneath. Beneath bountiful beauty beckons. Burgeoning leaves sponges for raindrops. Drinking rain. Saturated soil. Carcasses of coho salmon. Laid gracefully at your trunk. Weathered native hands know its nitrogen enriches your ground. Gulping roots, connecting to neighbors, binding to fungal networks, stretching your hands, hands feeding 5,000. You stand the tallest, tallest one providing legs to countless. So there's multiple layers at work here that I really was intentional about. So the first being I wanted the poem to not just look like a redwood, but in the lines have it descend down the redwood tree. And so what I mean by that is each line, um, what I write about in each line corresponds with that section of the tree. So it really feels like you're journeying down the tree. So at the top, the first three lines, gulping fresh fog, spindly needles drinking. There's actually two distinct leaf shapes for redwood trees. One at the very top of the redwood, and one at the lower canopies, the ones that we can normally see. And the ones at the very top are very narrow. They're very spindly. And those needles absorb the fog. And so that's what those lines refer to. Um, and then I say bark's acid, your shield, shielding your armor from critters. So that has to do with inside the bark of redwood trees is this acidic substance called tannic acid. If you've ever gone wine tasting, they talk about tannins. That's what it is. It's not exactly the same chemical compound as the one that's found in redwoods, but it's in common foods like chocolate, red wine, things like that. And in the redwood tree, um, it's the tree's natural repellent. So it's a fire retardant, so it makes redwoods extremely resistant to fire. And it's also a repellent for different types of insects that can cause, bacterial infestations in bark and trees. Um, and then further down the tree, kind of where we're in like the still like the top third to top half of the tree is where you see a lot of the woodpeckers dwell. Woodpeckers, shielding acorns, they tread carefully. Bark's acid, a strong repellent. And then as you go further down, um, I talk about bulging burls. So burls are these massive, they almost look like these like ginormous hornets' nests. And they can grow, they typically grow at the base of the tree. Um, but sometimes, they can grow a little bit further up the tree. And they're these massive growths with tiny bud shoots inside. And so what redwood trees do is when the mother tree experiences any sort of external disruption or threat, like a fire or a drought or a broken limb. Redwoods are because their roots are shallow, they're very susceptible to falling, branches breaking. So there's a lot of disruptions that redwoods experience, and these burrows will form, and they're essentially like these big nests with baby redwood trees, and uh, redwoods will release these baby bud shoots, and these baby trees will start to grow, and these baby trees support the mother tree through their root system. They share nutrients, they share water, they tap into these, mycorrhizal connections with fungus. And I'll get more to the real network genius of the root system in a bit. But that's what that refers to. Um, and then further down, as you get down to the base of the tree, um, the lines, carcasses of coho salmon laid gracefully at your trunk, whether natives' hands know its nitrogen enriches your ground. So th this was one of the most fascinating things that I learned during my time in Muir Woods. So, as is typical with redwood trees, given that they love to grow in moist uh, colder coastal regions, they are almost always surrounded by a body of water, whether that is a creek, a river, and in those creeks and rivers are salmon and other types of fish. And scientists have found recently what Native Americans have somehow knew for tens of thousands of years is that there is a rare isotope of nitrogen that exists in salmon that is also found in the trunks of redwood trees. And so what Native Americans would do is, they would you really utilize their fishing techniques to harvest, you know, coho salmon, steelhead trout, different types of fish. And they will take the carcass and lay it at the trunk of the redwood tree because as the salmon decomposes, it enriches not only the soil but the tree itself. It's this beautiful image of life after death continuing to be useful and go straight back into the earth and enrich more life. Um, and then at the end, gulping roots connecting to neighbors, binding to fungal networks. So there's this um it's aptly called the Wood Wide Web, which is the underground array of interconnected webs of root systems of all sorts of different types of trees that bind with mycorrhizae, which are the underground uh, biomass of mushrooms. Most people don't realize that I think it's something like less than 1% of the biomass of mushrooms exists above the ground. So the mushrooms that we eat are just a fraction of the percentage of what a fungi actually is. And these mycorrhizal networks are these very skinny, spindly strands that connect to roots, and they work in this symbiotic exchange of carbon and sugars and water. Um, and redwoods are no exception to this. In fact, they are one of the most productive members of this wood wide web. Um, Redwood roots can stretch out the length of a football field, and they are very communal and they are very reliant on their neighbors to assist them in times of need. The scientists have actually found that this isn't exclusive to redwoods, but redwoods do this as well, is they send specific chemical signals to essentially ask for certain nutrients. So there's this like communicative language of barter of nutrients below the ground. And then the last four lines, stretching your hands, hands feeding 5,000. It's hard for me to write a poem these days without a biblical reference. So this is, the hand stretched of Jesus to the Father, hand stretch of a disciple to the Son of God, and then hands feeding 5,000. Jesus, the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. This image of this this ability in such rich abundance that the redwoods have to be able to be distributors as much as they are harvesters of the nutrients below the ground. And you stand the tallest one, providing legs to countless. Redwoods are the tallest trees in the world, and yet they are responsible for much of the oxygen that we breathe. Uh, and they provide shade and soil enrichment to insects, fish, plants, all sorts of different types of animals. They provide shelter for woodpeckers. Um, and so connecting now this poem and the symbolic imagery of it to this idea of generativity, I think the redwood is such a great and powerful example to us all of what a life what a life of service um, and strength and resilience can look like. Redwoods are not just the tallest trees in the world, they're also the oldest. Some redwoods have been dated to be over 2,000 years old. And so they've survived countless natural disasters, um, fluctuations in weather, ice ages, um, the rise and fall of different empires, obviously the utter devastation um, of logging and deforestation, and yet these redwoods persist. And and thinking about going into middle adulthood, it's as Brene Brown says, there's no free lunch. Like no one gets to middle adulthood without having gone through loss, grief, tragedy, heartbreak, disappointment, failed dreams, um, shame, all sorts of things. And what it means, I think, to me to be truly generative is not that you just power through and s soldier on through life and kind of adopt this very insular kind of like alpha male energy, but it's the ability to, in the face of suffering, to make meaning of it and to continue to see a reason to deepen your relationship with yourself, with others, with the world. And ultimately that culminates in, one of the Christian theological virtues is hope. And I think so much of generativity, I talked about this in my discussion post this week. I think so much of generativity is inextricably bound up with this idea of hope. And, when we go into nature and we observe these living beings that have endured so much and yet every spring are continuing to push out more buds. And even though those leaves fall, if they're not deciduous, they fall in the fall and the life looks pretty bare in the winter. Every spring there's new birth. And I think such a hallmark of this stage of life where for many people they're going through a period of kind of either voluntary self-imposed or out of their control, kind of this stripping away of a lot of what they thought served them in maybe young adulthood, but actually doesn't. Maybe someone has gotten a divorce. Maybe they've quit their job. Um, maybe their kids are growing up and their kids are leaving, and that's a sort of mourning process. Uh, and it's a critical time of, are you going to wallow in your own shame and self-pity and grief and sadness, or are you going to really face it and on the other side of it have wisdom and insight to be able to provide your kids, your grandkids, your students, friends, the world. Um, and I love this idea that um, true wisdom is earned through suffering. I've never met anyone who I would call wise who hasn't just encountered suffering, but truly experienced it, um, and integrated it in a way that is oriented towards um, community um, and compassionate engagement in the world. Um, and for me, being in Muir Woods and staring up at these trees that I couldn't even see the tops of, most of them, and just thinking about, some of those trees are over 1,000 years old. Um, it really puts into perspective like how silly most of our everyday kind of squabbles and arguments and disagreements are in the grand scheme of things. And so I think generate experiencing generativity comes from this understanding that even though I have a friend who says the world is always ending, it at every moment it feels like the world is about to end. The apocalypse is imminent. And this time is certainly no different. It might be the closest we've felt in a very long time to that. But thinking about life that has existed for thousands of years, it fills me with a certain belief that the world actually won't end. And even if it will tomorrow, I have no control over that. And so I choose to live in a world and believe in a world that can become more beautiful every day. And at the very least is worth caring for. Um, so that's my poem and that's my share. Thank you for listening. Until next week.